The night was quiet, the streets eerily still, but inside Officer Ethan Foster, an uneasy feeling crept in. A dusty old sedan passed the stop sign, an innocuous mistake, seemingly insignificant. But as he approached the vehicle, everything changed. The driver was courteous, the paperwork in order, but it was the girl in the back seat who sent a shiver down his spine. Her vacant stare, a stiff smile, and the tiny hands clutching a doll as if it were the last shred of comfort. Ethan sensed something terribly wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on it. The question is, was Ethan's gut right? And if so, that girl needs saving before it's too late. The story ahead will keep you on the edge of your seat. The story begins. That night, the silence was strangely profound as Officer Ethan Foster cruised through the suburban streets. Ethan was an experienced, dedicated, and deeply perceptive police officer. Tall with a thoughtful demeanor and sharp eyes, he was the epitome of a justice keeper. Though serious, Ethan was especially sensitive to cases involving children. With meticulous attention to detail and boundless patience, he navigated challenges with unwavering perseverance. His compassionate heart always put the safety of children first, and he was willing to face any danger to bring peace to the community. The hum of the patrol car engine and the faint crackle of the radio were the only sounds that broke the quiet. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 10 p.m. A boring shift, nothing out of the ordinary, a shift where officers could easily fall into a routine. But Ethan knew better than to get complacent. Quiet nights often had a way of revealing the unexpected. His headlights caught movement at the intersection ahead. A worn sedan rolled through a stop sign, the driver perhaps unaware or deliberately ignoring the law. Ethan sighed and flicked on his siren. It wasn't a major violation, but a stop sign was a stop sign. And he wasn't about to let it slide. The sedan slowed and pulled over to the side. Ethan parked behind it, his mind already calculating familiar possibilities. A distracted driver, someone running late from work, or perhaps a teenager pushing boundaries. He radioed in with a calm, professional tone. "Dispatch, this is Officer Foster. I'm stopping a dark sedan, plate number 4A2F291, routine traffic stop, no backup needed." Stepping out of his car, the cold night air hit him. The sound of his boots clicking on the pavement echoed as he approached the driver's side window. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years in the field, but every sense was alert, scanning for anything out of place. The window rolled down gently, and Ethan was met with the smile of a man who seemed a little too well put together for the late hour. The man appeared to be around 45, with neatly combed hair, a buttoned-up shirt, and a calm, somewhat forced expression. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice warm and composed, as if he had rehearsed the greeting. "What seems to be the problem?" Ethan glanced into the car. In the backseat, a little girl sat there, clutching a doll to her chest. She appeared to be no older than 5, her blonde hair falling around her pale face. Her small frame was stiff, sitting rigidly as though trying to disappear into the seat. She offered Ethan a faint smile, but her eyes lacked any real light. "Good evening," Ethan replied calmly. "You ran the stop sign back there. Was there a reason for that?" The man chuckled softly, looking a bit embarrassed. "Oh, sorry about that. I got a little distracted, just trying to get home." Ethan nodded, keeping his eyes on the man. "Driver's license and registration, please." Without hesitation, the man opened the glove compartment, pulled out the necessary documents, and handed them to Ethan. "My name's Eric Johnson," he said smoothly. "This is my daughter, Sophie. We were just at a late dinner at my sister's house. Sophie's a bit tired, as you can see." Sophie's small head nodded slightly as if in agreement, but the movement was mechanical, almost unnatural. Ethan noticed her small fingers tightly clutching the doll, the joints of her fingers turning white. As Eric glanced towards her, Ethan caught a brief, almost imperceptible flinch. From the girl, a subtle, near undetectable motion, but enough to stir a feeling of unease. "Sophie, right?" Ethan asked, turning his gaze to the girl. "Are you all right?" Ethan's question was more than just a casual inquiry. It was a check, a way to ensure nothing troubling was happening. The girl's smile faltered for a brief moment before she nodded. "Yes, sir. she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric quickly interjected, "She's just tired, officer, long night, you know." Eric's hasty interruption only deepened Ethan's suspicion. Ethan glanced back at the man. "Where do you live?" "Just outside the city," Eric replied without hesitation. "Near Meadowbrook Lane." The response was too quick. Ethan studied Eric's face for a moment, noticing the thin layer of sweat on his forehead despite the coolness of the night air. He then looked down at the driver's license and registration. Everything checked out, Eric Johnson, Meadowbrook Lane, matching the records. But something still didn't feel right. The girl's smile seemed forced, her movement stiff, and her eyes never met his. They darted anxiously around the car. When Eric's hand lightly rested on her shoulder, as though to comfort her, Ethan saw Sophie shrink back slightly, pulling away just enough to raise his discomfort. "He seems like a good father, Mr. Johnson," Ethan said, testing the waters. "It's not often I see a father and daughter out this late." Eric chuckled again, but it sounded hollow. "Yeah, it's not always a late dinner like this, but family is important, you know." Ethan nodded politely but maintained his calm demeanor. "Of course, but just a word of caution, make sure to come to a complete stop at stop signs, for everyone's safety." Eric quickly nodded. "Of course, officer, it won't happen again." Ethan stepped back from the car, the unease lingering. He wanted to investigate further, but there was no clear reason to hold them, and he knew he couldn't justify doing so. "All right, you can go," Ethan said. "Drive safely." "Good night, officer," Eric replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. As the car pulled away, Ethan stood there, watching it disappear into the darkness, his hand instinctively resting on his gun. There was something in their conversation that unsettled him, a gut feeling honed over years on the job. The man's overly polite demeanor, the girl's eerie stillness, the subtle gestures, it didn't add up. He returned to his patrol car, still thinking about the encounter. Sitting in the driver's seat, he pulled out his notebook and jotted down the license plate, 4A2F291. The unease wouldn't leave him, and Ethan wasn't the type to ignore his instincts. He looked out at the empty road, the quietness of the night enveloping everything. The car had long since disappeared, but the image of little Sophie clutching her doll haunted him. Something wasn't right, but Ethan couldn't yet put his finger on what it was. Back at the station, the atmosphere remained still. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional ring of the phone pierced the silence. It was nearly 9:30 p.m., and most of the night shift was either out on patrol or buried in paperwork. Ethan sat at his desk, but his mind wasn't on the stack of reports before him. It kept drifting back to the encounter with Eric Johnson and the girl in the backseat. Something wouldn't leave him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, replaying the scene in his mind. The man's too perfect appearance, the stiff posture of the girl, her pale face, the faint, almost unnatural smile, the avoiding eyes, her hand gripping the doll like it was her lifeline. There was something off, but off wasn't enough to act on, at least not yet. Ethan opened his notebook and flipped to the page with the sedan's license plate, 4A2F291. He stared at it for a moment before typing it into the database. While waiting for the system to process, he tapped his pen against the desk, the unease growing stronger. The search results popped up on the screen, registered under Eric Johnson, Meadowbrook Lane address. No prior criminal record. On paper, Eric was clean, a regular citizen. But Ethan knew appearances could be deceiving. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and pulled up the video from the patrol car's camera. The blurry footage played, showing him approaching the sedan, the man's face appearing, his smile almost too overtly fake. Ethan fast-forwarded to the part where he spoke to Sophie, pausing on her face. He couldn't shake the emptiness in her eyes, the way they darted around, as if she were searching for an escape. As Ethan replayed the video, one detail caught his attention. He rewound the tape, leaning in closer to the screen. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Sophie's lips barely moved as she held her doll tightly. Ethan rewound again and slowed the footage, trying to catch the exact moment her lips formed two words, "Help me." The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His heart raced as he slumped back in his chair, staring at the screen. The girl had tried to communicate, to cry out for help without drawing attention to herself. The faint whisper of desperation locked everything into place. For him, this wasn't just a strange encounter, it was something far worse. He turned back to the computer, reopened Eric Johnson's file, and this time, searched more thoroughly. He expanded the search to neighboring counties and states. As he scrolled through the results, a pattern began to emerge. Eric's name appeared in multiple reports, though none with formal charges, but there were vague references to suspicious behavior around children, interviews related to missing children, and even an anonymous tip claiming he had been seen leaving a park with a child who later went missing. Ethan's uneasy feeling shifted into a cold fear. Despite the lack of clear evidence linking Eric to any crimes, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever Eric was, there were missing children. The room seemed to grow colder as Ethan opened a separate window on his computer and searched for recent Amber Alerts. His chest tightened when he found a report that matched the description of the little girl he'd just seen. Sophie Miller, 5 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, reported missing 4 days ago from a playground in Ridgefield, approximately 55 miles away. The report detailed how the girl had been playing with friends. When she disappeared, witnesses had seen a man driving a dark sedan near the playground just before she vanished. Ethan's heart raced as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The pieces of the puzzle fit together clearly and horrifyingly. Sophie wasn't Eric's daughter. She wasn't on her way home from a family dinner. She was a missing child, and Eric Johnson was the one who had kidnapped her. His fist clenched as anger surged, mingling with panic. He had let them go, had watched them drive off into the night. His instincts had screamed, but he hadn't had a solid reason to act. Now, a child's life was at risk. "Damn it," he muttered, standing up abruptly. He grabbed his radio and called for backup. "This is Officer Foster. I need an APB on a dark sedan, license plate 4A2F291, registered to Eric Johnson. Possible abduction. The child matches an active Amber Alert. Notify Ridgefield PD and coordinate immediately." The voice of the dispatcher came through, calm but alert. "Copy that, Officer Foster. Sending out the alert now, please hold." Ethan paced the small corner of the station, his mind spinning. He couldn't sit still and he needed to do something. He pulled up the area map and marked potential routes Eric could take. Meadowbrook Lane was his address, but Ethan doubted he'd go there. If Eric had been operating in secret for this long, he wasn't dumb enough to lead the police to his doorstep. Ethan replayed the traffic stop in his mind, replaying every detail. Eric had been too calm, almost overly calm. People hiding something often overcompensate. And Sophie, her silence, her subtle movements, wasn't the behavior of a tired child. It was the behavior of someone afraid, trying not to draw attention from her captor. He sat back down at his desk and opened a new file, typing up a report about the traffic stop, including the video from the patrol car's camera. He flagged it for Detective Laura Benson, his teammate and someone he trusted implicitly. She'd know how to coordinate with Ridgefield's task force. But even after sending the email, Ethan knew he couldn't just wait for bureaucracy to take its course. He had to find them before it was too late. Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, determination in his gut. He didn't know where Eric would go, but he would find out. He couldn't stop imagining Sophie's face, her quiet plea for help. That image would haunt him until he brought her home safely. Stepping outside, the cold night air hit him, and his radio crackled to life. "Ethan, this is dispatch. Ridgefield PD has confirmed the Amber Alert. They're requesting coordination with task force units to check the Meadowbrook Lane address." "Copy," Ethan replied sharply as he climbed into his patrol car. "I'm heading out now." He turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The weight of what he had just discovered pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation now. A child's life depended on him. He sped down the road, his eyes scanning the empty streets ahead, every nerve on edge. The peaceful suburban streets that had seemed so quiet before now felt like a maze, one he was determined to navigate before it was too late. He couldn't let Sophie's faint cry for help go unanswered. The patrol car's tires hummed over the quiet streets as Ethan dialed his colleague's number. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, harder than usual. Dispatch had confirmed that the Amber Alert matched the girl he'd seen in the sedan. Every minute felt like an eternity, every second bringing him closer to Sophie disappearing forever. Detective Benson, Laura's voice crackled through the line, sharp as ever. Laura, it's me, Ethan. His voice was tight. Something's wrong. I stopped a sedan tonight. The driver's name is Eric Johnson. There was a little girl in the back, blonde hair, about 5 years old. Something felt off, but I let them go. I just checked the license plate and reviewed the video. Turns out, the girl matches an active Amber Alert. Sophie Miller, missing from Ridgefield 4 days ago. A brief silence hung on the line before Laura's voice cut through, sharp. As a knife. You mean to say you let them go? Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling the weight of that decision press down on him. Yes, I didn't have enough to hold them then, but now we know Eric Johnson has a history with child abduction, even though he's never been convicted. He's the one. He wouldn't let him slip away this time, not if we can catch him first. Laura looked up, her gaze unreadable. You're making this personal. Yes, I am, Ethan replied, his voice low but heavy with meaning. I met the girl, Laura. She was right in front of me, and I let her go. That's on me. But this time, I won't let him get away. Laura sighed, her tone softening. I get it, but beating yourself up won't help us find the girl. We need to stay focused. If he plans to move her, we need to think like him. Where would he go? What's his next step? Ethan rubbed his face, trying to keep the fury bubbling inside him in check. If he's been doing this for years, he's got a system. He's not reckless, which means he's got a place, somewhere remote, somewhere he knows won't be disturbed. Exactly, Laura said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up a map of the surrounding area, marking potential points of interest. We start with the obvious ones. His address on Meadowbrook Lane is a long shot, but I'll have a team check it out. Also, we need to look into motels, rest stops, or any secluded properties he might have access to. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the map. What about Ridgefield? If he took her from there, maybe he still has connections in that area? Good idea, Laura replied. I'll get in touch with the Ridgefield PD to see if they have any intel on his friends or any places he frequents. Laura's phone buzzed. She quickly read the message. Ridgefield PD just reported an old hunting cabin about 40 miles away. It's owned by Eric's uncle but has been abandoned for years. Worth checking out. Ethan stood up, grabbing his jacket. I'll head there now. I'm coming with you, Laura said, grabbing the car keys. The drive to the cabin was tense. The narrow dirt road leading to the property was overgrown with weeds, the headlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The cabin came into view, a dilapidated wooden house that looked as though it could collapse at any moment. Ethan and Laura parked some distance away and approached on foot, flashlights sweeping the area, carefully scanning. The cabin's windows were boarded up, and the front door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. Ethan's heart raced as they stepped onto the creaking porch. Control, this is Detective Benson, Laura spoke into the radio. We've arrived, proceeding with caution. Copy that, came the reply. Ethan pushed open the door, the flashlight cutting through the damp, musty darkness. The inside was empty, the furniture covered in dust, spider webs everywhere. It was clear no one had been here for years. Nothing, Laura muttered, the beam of her flashlight scanning the barren room. If he's got a system, he's already one step ahead of us. Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration rising once more. We're running out of time. Laura nodded. Let's go back to square one. Focus on his most recent movements. People like him don't stray too far from familiar territory. Ethan squinted, recalling the neighborhood where he had stopped Eric's car earlier. Let's start there. The neighborhood was eerily quiet when Ethan Foster parked his patrol car at the corner where he had stopped Eric Johnson just hours earlier. The porch lights flickered weakly in the night, casting faint, hazy rings on the sidewalk. Ethan stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the area. He had let them go, looked Sophie Miller in the eyes and watched her disappear into the night with the man he now knew for sure was a predator. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Laura sighed, frustration evident in her voice. God damn it, Ethan. All right, give me all the information you've got on him. License plate, last known address, vehicle description. I'll coordinate with the Ridgefield Task Force. We need to move fast. I'm sending the patrol car camera footage and the report right now, Ethan said, his other hand already typing on his laptop. Controls issued the APB, but I'm guessing he won't be heading back to his old address. If he's smart, and he seems damn smart, he'll try to move her tonight. He knows the cops are coming. Laura's voice hardened. Then we don't have time to wait. Let me pull up his file and see if there are any patterns. Does he have family, friends, or any safe houses? I'm on it, Ethan replied. But this guy's slippery. He's been connected to similar cases across several states, but never caught. He knows how to stay hidden. Not for long, Laura said firmly. Meet me at the station in 15 minutes. We'll make a search plan and coordinate with Ridgefield. On the road, Ethan replied, ending the call and pressing the gas pedal. At the station, the air was thick with tension. Ethan and Laura were deep in the files of Eric Johnson. It was a tangled mess of obscure connections and near misses. Eric had been interrogated across several states, always linked to missing children cases, but never formally charged. He was too slick, too meticulous, and far too good at covering his tracks. He has a pattern, Laura said, her eyes scanning through the file. He targets public spaces, parks, playgrounds, places where kids might wander off. Children go missing, and he holds them for a few days before moving them. No one knows where he takes them, but once authorities close in, he's gone. Ethan leaned toward her, his jaw tightening. He walked along the street, knocking on each door, hoping someone had seen something. Most people hesitated to answer at such a late hour. Their suspicious eyes peeked through cracks in doors or barely open windows, just enough to get a glimpse. Finally, an elderly woman, tightly wrapped in a woolen robe, cracked the door open just wide enough to make out his figure. Sorry to bother you, ma'am, Ethan began, showing his police badge. I'm Officer Foster. I'm investigating a missing child case and wanted to ask if you've seen a black sedan in the area tonight. The driver is a white male, and there was a little girl sitting in the back seat. The woman furrowed her brow, her forehead creased as she tried to recall. I think I did, she replied, pointing toward the curb near her house. It was parked right there. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but the driver kept looking around, like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. Ethan's heart raced. Did you see which way they went? No, but the little girl in the back caught my attention, she continued, her voice filled with concern. She looked so scared, poor thing. It struck me as odd, but I wasn't sure what was going on. Ethan nodded, her confirmation heightening his growing sense of dread. Thank you. If you remember anything else, don't hesitate to call me. He handed her a business card and walked back to the patrol car. His mind was spinning with speculation. Eric wasn't acting on impulse. He was moving according to a well-thought-out pattern. But why this neighborhood? What connection did he have here? As Ethan climbed into the car, the radio crackled to life. Officer Foster, this is dispatch. We just received information from a waitress at a diner south of your location. She reported seeing a man matching Eric Johnson's description with the little girl tonight. The man seemed anxious, and the girl appeared frightened. Ethan gripped the radio mic tightly. What's the address? The dispatcher read off the address, a roadside diner near the highway, not far from where Eric had last been spotted. Ethan plugged the address into the GPS and floored the accelerator. The uneasy feeling that had simmered since the stop now flared up like fire in his chest. He was getting closer, but each passing second felt like hours. Ethan pulled into the gas station where he'd stopped earlier, hoping to follow any trace of Eric. The fluorescent lights flickered above the empty parking lot, casting sharp shadows against the concrete. Inside, a young attendant was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. Ethan entered, his badge already in hand. Good evening, he said, his voice firm. I'm Officer Foster. I need to ask you a few questions. The attendant stood up straight, quickly shoving his phone into his pocket. Yes, officer. What's going on? I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here tonight, Ethan began, keeping his tone even. A black, old-model sedan, a man in his mid-40s with a 5-year-old girl, blonde hair. Did you see them? The attendant furrowed his brow, trying to recall. Yeah, I think so. They came by a few hours ago, probably around 5 p.m. The guy filled up the gas tank, bought some snacks. The little girl was holding a doll. What about the man? Ethan leaned in, his voice insistent. Did he do or say anything unusual? The attendant hesitated, his expression growing uneasy. He seemed in a hurry, but tried not to show it. The little girl dropped her doll when they were heading back to the car, and when she bent down to pick it up, he yelled at her for being stupid. She looked scared but didn't say anything. She just picked up the doll and climbed back in the car. Ethan's stomach twisted. He could picture Sophie's small, trembling hands clutching the doll, her eyes avoiding his during the traffic stop. Did you notice which way they went? Yeah, they turned onto Pine Street, heading south toward the highway. Ethan quickly jotted down the details in his notebook. Thanks. If you remember anything else, please give me a call. He handed over a business card and stepped back outside. The cool night air slapped against his face like a slap. Ethan leaned against the hood of his patrol car, his mind racing through the clues. Eric Johnson was not just a predator, he was a ticking time bomb. The tension in Sophie's posture, the way she shrank from Eric, now painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. As Ethan prepared to leave, the radio crackled to life once again. Officer Foster, this is dispatch. The waitress at the diner has additional information. She says the man seemed anxious and mentioned needing to find a place to rest. He might still be in the area. Ethan straightened, his heartbeat quickening. What's the address? The dispatcher quickly provided the details, and Ethan sped out of the parking lot. I'm on my way, he replied, gripping the steering wheel as the car raced through the empty streets. The diner was only a few miles away, located in a prime spot for someone like Eric on the outskirts of the city, near the freeway but far enough to avoid attention. As Ethan neared the diner, the open 24 hours neon sign flickered faintly in the dark. He parked close to the entrance, took a deep breath, and surveyed the parking lot. There were only a few scattered cars, none of them matching Eric's black sedan. Ethan stepped out of the car, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. His heart pounded, a mix of adrenaline and determination driving him forward. The waitress inside might hold the crucial lead to pinpoint Eric's location. The door chime jingled softly as Ethan entered. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. Flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the nearly empty space, with a middle-aged waitress behind the counter, her tired eyes weary, a name tag reading Emma. She looked up from wiping the counter. You're the cop, aren't you? She said, sitting up straight. I called about the man with the little girl. Ethan nodded, his eyes sharp as a knife. That's right, Officer Foster. Tell me everything you saw. Emma put down the rag and crossed her arms over her chest. They came in about an hour ago. The man ordered coffee and a sandwich, but the way he spoke to the little girl wasn't right. She looked terrified, just twirling her doll, and he snapped at her when she wouldn't sit still, telling her to behave like a normal child. Poor thing, she didn't say a word, just sat there staring at her plate. Ethan's jaw clenched. Did he say anything else out of the ordinary? Did he mention where he was going next? Emma nodded. Yeah, at one point he was on the phone, said he needed to find a place to sleep. There's a motel near the freeway, Riverside Lodge. It's pretty run down, but it's the closest. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Did he seem in a hurry? Emma hesitated, her face scrunching with discomfort. Not really, but he kept looking at the door like he was worried someone was following him. Thank you, Ethan said, handing her a business card. If you remember anything else, call me. Emma nodded, concern etched across her face. I hope the little girl's okay. She doesn't seem safe with him. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, then quickly exited the diner. Outside, adrenaline surged through him, his heart racing. He pulled out the radio and contacted Laura. I've got a lead. Eric might be at Riverside Lodge, off Highway 5. It's the closest motel, and the waitress said he mentioned needing a place to sleep. Got it, I'm on my way. I'll meet you there in 15. Ethan sped off, his siren off to avoid drawing attention. The road ahead was eerily quiet, with only the occasional car passing by in the opposite direction. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he neared the motel. The neon lights of Riverside Lodge flickered weakly in the night, like the fading pulse of a dying creature. Just as Emma described, Riverside Lodge was filthy and run down. The parking lot was uneven, cracked pavement overrun with weeds. A few cars were parked haphazardly, their windows fogged over. The single-story building had rooms lined along. A porch, peeling paint, dim porch lights too weak to fully illuminate the entrance. Ethan spotted Laura's unmarked car at the far corner of the lot. He parked beside it and stepped out, his heart pounding as he approached her vehicle. Laura rolled down the window, her expression tense. "The clerk says Eric is here," Laura reported. "He checked into room 13 about an hour ago." Ethan's gaze darted to the end of the row of rooms, where dim light seeped through the closed blinds of room 13. "Are we sure the little girl's with him?" Laura nodded, her voice dropping. "The clerk said she's with him." She looked scared, but he brushed it off, saying she was just tired. Ethan clenched his fists, the image of Sophie's pale, terrified face cutting through his thoughts like a knife. "We can't wait any longer. We need to act now." Laura placed a hand on his, her voice firm. "Ethan, we need to do this smart. If we go in too hard, he could panic and hurt her. We have to wait for the right moment." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded. They crouched in the shadows across from the room, their eyes locked on the partially open blinds. Inside, Eric paced back and forth, his movements restless and uneasy. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her doll tightly. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the tension in her hunched posture, her small shoulders seeming to shrink as though trying to disappear into the shadows. Time dragged on, each passing minute feeling like a century as Ethan watched Eric mutter to himself, his gestures growing more erratic. His patience was wearing thin, the nagging thought of the danger Sophie was in gnawing at him. But he forced himself to remain steady. Finally, Eric grabbed the pack of cigarettes from the bedside table and walked toward the door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "This is it," he whispered to Laura. They watched as Eric stepped outside, the glow of his cigarette flickering in the dark. He stood on the porch, unaware of their presence in the shadows. Ethan exchanged a glance with Laura. She nodded. "Now." Ethan moved quickly, silently, his steps barely making a sound on the gravel. Eric didn't realize until it was too late. Ethan seized him from behind, twisting his arm and forcing him to drop the cigarette. Eric yelped in pain as he was slammed against the wall. "Eric Johnson," Ethan growled. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping of Sophie Miller. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Eric struggled, his voice a mix of panic and fury. "You're making a mistake. She's my daughter." "Save it," Laura said, stepping forward to slap the handcuffs onto his wrists. "We'll sort everything out at the station." Eric spit on the ground, his wild eyes fixed on them. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're making a huge mistake." Ignoring his protests, Ethan dragged him toward the patrol car, leaving Laura behind to check the room. But before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a loud rustling came from the trees behind the inn. The sound was enough to stop Ethan in his tracks. "What the hell was that?" Laura muttered, instinctively placing her hand on her weapon. Ethan turned, his eyes scanning the dark edge of the woods. "Stay with him. I'll check it out." Before Ethan could take another step, Sophie suddenly burst from the room, her small figure darting toward the trees. "Sophie!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the still night. She didn't stop, her panicked footsteps quickly fading into the darkness. In a matter of seconds, she vanished between the trees. Ethan's heart raced, urgency flooding his chest. But before he could give chase, something else caught his attention. A shadowy figure darted along the edge of the woods. The forest stretched out before him like a labyrinth of darkness as Ethan Foster plunged in, his flashlight cutting through the thick air. The damp smell of decaying leaves and earth filled his nostrils. Branches scraped against his uniform, but he didn't slow down. Sophie's faint cries echoed from the distance, a dim beacon guiding him forward. His breath was heavy, frantic, his heart pounding as the darkness closed in around him. "Sophie!" Ethan called, his voice reverberating through the stillness. "It's Officer Foster. I'm here to help you." The weak beam of his flashlight swept through the dense brush, illuminating tangled roots and vines. Every snap of a twig beneath his feet startled him, his nerves taut. The forest seemed alive, each rustling and whispering breeze a reminder of Sophie's vulnerability, and now his own, lost in the blackness. A faint sob drifted toward Ethan, barely audible over the rapid thudding of his heart. He froze, turning in the direction of the sound. "Sophie," he called again, softer now. "I'm coming for you. Don't move." But as he took another step, a chilling sensation ran down his spine. Something was wrong. It wasn't just Sophie's cries. He sensed another presence, someone else. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized he wasn't alone in this forest. Back at the inn, Laura tightened her grip on Eric Johnson, who was sneering despite his cuffed hands. "You think you've won, don't you?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You're wasting your time." "Shut up," Laura snapped, her eyes flicking toward the edge of the forest. She knew Ethan could handle himself, but Eric's smug expression made it hard for her to feel at ease. "You have no idea," Eric said, his voice laced with glee. "You'll regret this." Laura shot him a hard look, but her focus quickly returned to the woods. She could still hear Ethan calling out weakly for Sophie, but the forest seemed to swallow his voice, and she knew she couldn't help him if things went wrong. Ethan pressed on, his flashlight cutting through the dense, oppressive darkness. The sobs grew louder, guiding him deeper into the forest. But the feeling of being watched never let up. He paused, his ears straining for anything beyond Sophie's cries. A branch snapped behind him, the sharp crack echoing in the still night. Ethan spun around, the flashlight sweeping across the trees. The light only revealed shifting shadows and swaying branches. His hand instinctively reached for his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. Not yet. "Sophie, it's okay," he said, his voice firm even though his insides were coiled with tension. "I'm here. I'll protect you." Another sound, this time from the left. He turned, the flashlight sweeping across a cluster of trees. For a split second, he thought he saw something move, a shadow darting between the trunks. His grip on the flashlight tightened, his heartbeat quickening. The people here weren't just watching, they were closing in. "Who's there?" Ethan commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Come out." Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, eerily quiet, not even a rustle from the night creatures. Ethan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to steady his nerves. Panic wouldn't help him or Sophie. He moved toward the sound of the cries, now clearer. "Sophie, I'm almost there. Just wait for me." Finally, he spotted a small clearing ahead, a figure huddled against the base of a tree. "Sophie." A wave of relief washed over him, and he quickened his pace. But his joy was short-lived. A heavy step echoed from behind, followed by the unmistakable metallic sound of a knife being drawn. Ethan spun around just in time, the blade glinting in the dim light of the flashlight. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the hood of a black hoodie, his movements low and predatory. This wasn't a random passerby, this was an accomplice of Eric Johnson. "Stay still," Ethan ordered, his voice unwavering despite the blood pounding in his veins. He pivoted, positioning himself between Sophie and the threat, who was still crouched by the tree. The man didn't respond, charging forward, the knife aimed at Ethan's chest. Ethan barely dodged, the blade slicing through the air just inches from his shoulder. He swung the flashlight like a club, striking the attacker's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, but the assailant didn't relent. He shoved Ethan into a tree, pain jolting through his spine as he hit the bark with a brutal thud, but he held his ground. Grabbing the man's arm, he twisted it behind him in one swift, practiced motion. The man howled, slamming his elbow into Ethan's ribs. The blow knocked him off balance, but Ethan didn't let go. "Run, Sophie." Ethan's voice cracked with urgency. "Go," he shouted again, his tone desperate. Sophie hesitated, her wide eyes flicking between Ethan and the chaotic struggle unfolding before her. "Go," he repeated, pleading. With a frantic glance, Sophie bolted, clutching her doll tightly as she disappeared into the thick forest. Ethan exhaled in relief, but there was no time to savor it. The man wrenched free from his grasp, stumbling to retrieve the knife from the ground. Ethan kicked it out of reach, lunging at him. They tumbled to the forest floor, wrestling in the dirt, the man thrashing wildly, fueled by sheer desperation. Ethan managed to pin him down, but not before the assailant raked his sharp nails down Ethan's arm, leaving deep scratches. "Stop!" Ethan roared, his knee pressing into the attacker's back. He reached for his radio, but the man jerked violently, almost throwing him off. Ethan gritted his teeth as pain radiated from the gashes on his arm. With one hand, he fumbled for the handcuffs, snapping one around the man's wrist and struggling to lock the other. The attacker screamed hoarsely, but Ethan didn't back down. Finally, the cuffs clicked shut, and the struggle ceased. Ethan hauled the man to his feet, his breath ragged. "Who are you?" His voice was ice cold. "Why are you helping him?" The man remained silent, a sneer twisting his lips into a mocking grin. Ethan shook him hard, his patience wearing thin. "Tell me!" But the man only chuckled, the sound dark and menacing. Ethan, undeterred, dragged him toward the inn, his arm aching and blood soaking through his sleeve. But that didn't matter. His priority was Sophie, getting her to safety. As they neared the edge of the woods, Sophie's small figure appeared behind a tree, the doll still clutched in her hands. She looked up at Ethan, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "It's okay, Sophie," Ethan said gently, bending down despite the pain still radiating through his body. "You're safe now." She hesitated for a moment before rushing into his arms, her tiny hands gripping his uniform. Ethan lifted her up, holding her close as he made his way back toward the inn, her body trembling against his. He could feel her begin to relax, resting her head against his chest. Behind him, Laura appeared, weapon in hand as she apprehended the accomplice. "Are you okay?" she asked, her gaze assessing the blood-stained arm Ethan had yet to address. "I'll live," Ethan replied, still focused on Sophie. "We just need to get her out of here." As they headed toward the waiting patrol cars, Ethan felt Sophie's hands tighten around his neck. It had been a nightmare of a night, but she was safe now, and that was all that mattered. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room cast a cold, indifferent glow as Eric Johnson slouched in his chair, his hands cuffed to the metal table. He wore a smug expression, his lips curled into a contemptuous sneer. Facing him, Detective Laura Benson sat, arms crossed, her sharp eyes piercing through him. "You're wasting your time," Eric scoffed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Sophie is my daughter. You'll look pretty foolish once you figure that out." Laura remained unfazed. She had dealt with people like him before, predators hiding their depravity behind a mask of charm and lies. She opened a file, sliding a photo of Sophie across the table. "This is Sophie Miller," she said coldly. "She's 5 years old and was abducted 4 days ago from her front yard in Pinehurst. Her parents are frantic. By the way, would you care to explain how she ended up in your hands?" Eric leaned back, the cuffs clinking as they hit the table. "I told you she's my daughter. We were just passing through town, visiting family. You know, family stuff." Laura's lips tightened, her face subtly tensing as she flipped to another page in the file. She pulled out a copy of Sophie's birth certificate and placed it on the table, her tone icily precise. "Eric, we've confirmed her identity with the Meadowville Police Department. Her parents provided a DNA sample, and Sophie has been positively identified as their daughter. So let me ask you again, how did she end up in your car?" Eric's smirk faltered for a brief moment before snapping back into place. "Look, you've got it wrong. I didn't kidnap anyone. The girl came with me willingly." Laura slammed her hand onto the table, the sound sharp and jarring, filling the small room. "Enough. Stop lying. You've been caught red-handed, Eric. Do you know how terrified she was of you? She didn't come with you willingly. She's just a child, and you're a monster preying on kids. The sooner you admit it, the easier it'll be for you." Eric's face darkened, the smirk vanishing completely. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snarled. "You think you're so smart, but you don't understand how the real world works." Laura leaned in closer, her voice cold as ice, slicing through the tension in the room. "Then enlighten me." In the observation room next door, Ethan Foster stood motionless behind the one-way glass. His hands were clenched tightly, veins standing out on the backs of his hands. His gaze was fixed on Eric, every nerve in his body taut with the urge to storm into the room and confront the man directly. But Ethan knew he couldn't let his emotions take over. Sophie was safe, and his job now was to ensure Eric and his accomplices faced justice. He took a deep breath, his eyes briefly scanning the table behind him, where evidence from the motel had been laid out: forged documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, and guardianship papers. Everything was meticulously crafted, enough to convince anyone that Eric was Sophie's legal guardian. There were also a stack of passports hidden beneath the floorboards, each bearing the names and photos of different children, none matching those on the list. But the most chilling discovery was the ledger, filled with numbers and codes, a cold record of transactions in the human trafficking network. "This guy's been at it for a long time," Laura had said when they first found the ledger. "And he's definitely not working alone." Back in the interrogation room, Laura didn't ease up on the pressure. "We found the passports, Eric. Dozens of them, with children who aren't yours. And that ledger. It's clear as day what you've been doing." Eric ground his teeth but remained silent. "You're part of a human trafficking ring," Laura continued, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "You're kidnapping children, falsifying documents to pass them off as your own, and then selling them. How many children, Eric? How many families have you destroyed?" Finally, Eric couldn't hold it in anymore. He slammed his fist down on the table, roaring. "You don't know anything. You think you're the hero? You don't understand how the world works." Laura cut him off, her voice freezing. "Don't make excuses. They're children, not commodities. It's over for you, Eric. We have enough evidence to charge you and your accomplices." Eric slouched back in his chair, his chest heaving with rage, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. He knew he was cornered. Outside the interrogation room, Ethan paced back and forth, the weight of his thoughts gnawing at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, her small, vulnerable form clutching onto him in the woods. She was safe now, reunited with her parents, but the thought that she had almost been lost forever twisted his stomach. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Foster." Laura stepped out of the interrogation room, looking fatigued but resolute. "He won't talk about the trafficking ring, but we've got enough evidence to charge him with kidnapping Sophie and at least a dozen other children, based on all the forged documents." Ethan nodded, jaw clenched, glancing at Laura. "He's not saying much, but the evidence links both of them to the same ring. This is just the beginning." "Not enough yet," Ethan replied, his voice deep. "There are still many children out there. We need to dismantle this operation completely." Laura placed her hand on his shoulder, gentle yet firm. "We will, but we have to do it the right way. If we rush without solid evidence, we risk exposing everything and letting the real masterminds slip free." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to ease the tension building inside. She was right. As much as he was eager to act, they needed to build an undeniable case, not only to arrest Eric and his accomplices but to bring down the entire network. Hours later, as Eric was led out of the precinct, hands cuffed, Ethan stood by the entrance, quietly observing. The smug smile on Eric's face had vanished, replaced by an expression of grim defeat. His accomplices followed, cloaked in dark coats, their faces hidden in the shadows. Ethan's chest tightened as he thought of the notebook, filled with the names and faces of children who, like Sophie, had not been so fortunate. He silently vowed not to stop until he found each and every one of them. As the vehicle carrying Eric and his cohorts disappeared from sight, Laura stepped closer to him. "You did well, Foster," she said gently. "Sophie is safe because of you." Ethan shook his head. "Not enough. There are still so many children out there, families who don't know whether their kids are alive or not. We'll find them." Laura nodded, her voice resolute. "But it starts here with these two." The morning light filtered through the police station windows as Ethan Foster stood in the observation room, his eyes never leaving Sophie Miller, who was sitting with a young child psychologist. The little girl still clutched her small doll, the same doll she had held tightly throughout her painful journey. Sophie's small body seemed more fragile under the daylight, but in her eyes, there was still a quiet vitality, a resilience as her slender fingers traced fearful lines on the doll's dress. Ethan had been in this line of work long enough to recognize that trauma left invisible scars, scars that could take years to heal. But seeing Sophie here, safe and alive, was a moment he would never forget. She was here because he didn't give up, because he trusted his instincts when it mattered most. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Detective Laura Benson stepped in, her face showing exhaustion, but also a sense of relief. "Sophie's parents just arrived," she said quietly. "They're in the waiting room." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "How are they?" "Frightened, then relieved, every emotion you can imagine," Laura replied. "They're ready to meet their daughter." Ethan turned back, his gaze lingering on Sophie. The little girl had been through so much in the past days, and now she was about to be reunited with those who loved her most. "Bring them in," he said, his voice low but choked with emotion. The small waiting room, sparsely furnished, was heavy with an almost palpable tension, as though the four walls were closing in. Stella and Peter Miller sat side by side, their hands tightly clasped. Stella's face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying, while Peter sat upright, his jaw clenched as if holding back a flood of emotions about to burst. When Ethan entered, Stella immediately stood, her eyes searching his face, desperate for answers. "Is she okay? Where is she? Can we see her?" Her words rushed out, her voice catching with desperation. "She's okay," Ethan reassured, his tone soft but steady, calming the emotional storm in the room. "She's safe now, with a psychologist, but she's ready to see you both." Stella burst into tears, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sobs. Peter stood and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent strength. "We thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for bringing our little girl back." Peter's voice cracked with gratitude. Ethan nodded, signaling them to follow him. As they walked down the hallway, Stella quickened her pace, the urgency of wanting to be reunited with her daughter overwhelming everything else. Ethan opened the door to the room where Sophie was sitting and stepped back to allow them in. "Sophie," Stella whispered, her voice trembling as she moved toward her daughter. Sophie looked up, her large eyes filled with tears meeting her mother's gaze. A moment of silence, as if time had stopped. Then, Sophie dropped her doll and leapt from her chair, rushing into her mother's arms. "Mommy!" Sophie cried, her voice a mix of relief and desperation. "Mommy, I missed you." Stella collapsed to the floor, holding Sophie tightly, her body trembling with sobs. "I'm here, my love. I've got you. You're safe now." Peter knelt beside them, embracing both mother and daughter, tears streaming down his face. "We found you, sweetheart," he whispered. "We'll never let you go again." Ethan stood at the door, his throat tightening as he took in the scene. He had witnessed enough in his years as a police officer: violence, loss, pain. But this moment, this reunion, reminded him why he did this job. It was a vivid, pure emotion, the kind of moment you could never forget. As the family finally calmed down, Sophie turned her head, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ethan. She broke free from her parents' embrace, taking slow, hesitant steps toward him. The doll dangled from her right hand, her left hand gently tugging at the hem of his shirt. "Officer Foster," she said softly, looking up at him. Ethan bent down to meet her gaze. "What is it, Sophie?" She hesitated for a moment before wrapping her arms around his neck in a tight embrace. "Thank you for saving me." Ethan froze slightly, the weight of her words landing like a heavy punch. Slowly, he wrapped his arms around her in return, whispering, his voice barely audible, "You're welcome, Sophie. You're a brave girl." As she pulled away, she smiled, a tentative grin, the first one since the nightmare had begun. It was a smile that carried the meaning of trust, hope, and resilience. After Sophie and her parents left the police station, Ethan sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the pile of evidence on the desk. Fake documents, passports, and a ledger. Everything pointed to something far bigger than Eric Johnson. Sophie was safe, but what about the other children, the other families, who might not have such a happy ending? Laura walked in, a coffee cup in each hand. She placed one in front of him and sat across from him. "You okay?" she asked, her gaze penetrating. Ethan sighed, rubbing his face. "I should be. Okay. Sophie's safe, that's the important thing." But he trailed off, and Laura encouraged him to continue. "But it's not enough, is it?" "Not enough," Ethan admitted. "Eric and his associates are just cogs in a much larger machine. That ledger, it's a map of the entire network. We've got names, transactions, locations. We can't stop here." Laura nodded, her expression serious. "You're right. This is just the beginning. But we'll take them down, Ethan, step by step." Ethan looked at her, his eyes burning with determination. "I won't let another child go through what Sophie endured. No matter how long it takes, no matter how big this network is, we'll tear it down, piece by piece." Laura raised her coffee cup, a silent cheers to justice. Ethan lifted his cup as well, his vow enveloping the space. Justice. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters sat at the back, cameras and notebooks ready to capture every moment. Eric Johnson sat at the defendant's table, his usual smug expression replaced by a hollow, defiant stare. His accomplice sat beside him, clearly anxious, eyes darting around the room in fear. Both had defense attorneys at their sides, but the mountain of evidence against them left little room for hope. Ethan Foster sat in the courtroom, his hands still in a bandage from the injury he sustained during the chase in the woods. He hadn't wanted to attend the trial. Seeing Eric's face again made him feel a visceral anger and disgust, emotions he was still struggling to suppress. But he knew he needed to witness this, for Sophie, for the other children who weren't as lucky as she was. The judge's gavel echoed, shattering the silence in the room and silencing the murmurs. The jury filed in, their faces grave as they took their seats. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had waited for, after weeks of grueling investigation, hours spent poring over evidence, and the haunting memories of the case, all leading to this point. The jury foreperson stood, clearing their throat before holding up a piece of paper, the final word on the fate of Eric and his accomplice. In the case of Eric Johnson and Ryan Mitchell, we find the defendants guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and child trafficking. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, followed by murmured words of comfort. Sophie's parents, sitting a few rows in front of Ethan, gripped each other's hands, tears streaming down their faces. Stella Miller repeated, "Thank God," over and over, while Peter closed his eyes, clearly overwhelmed. Eric's expression stiffened, his jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead. His accomplice slumped in his seat, defeated. The judge's voice cut through the noise, ordering silence as she read the sentence. Both men were sentenced to life without parole. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his chest easing somewhat. Justice had been served, but as the gavel struck again, ending the trial, he knew his work wasn't over. In the weeks following the verdict, everything unfolded like a whirlwind. The evidence gathered during the investigation into Eric's operations led to a series of raids across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies worked in coordination, systematically dismantling the child trafficking network, and with each arrest came the rescue of more children. Every child was a poignant reminder of why Ethan chose this line of work. At the police station, Detective Laura Benson entered Ethan's office, her face lit with a rare excitement. "You won't believe this," she exclaimed, setting a thick file on his desk. "Another bust last night, 3 arrests and 4 kids saved." Ethan flipped through the file, his heart lifting slightly as he saw the faces of the children. "Good job," he said, his voice low but sincere. "Each arrest makes a difference." Laura leaned against the doorframe, watching him intently. "You should be proud of yourself, Ethan. Without you, this case wouldn't have come together." Ethan shook his head and closed the file. "It's not about me. It's about the kids." Sophie and all the others. They're the ones who matter. Laura nodded, fully understanding his perspective, but also aware that he deserved more recognition than he would ever accept. You've done great work, and I mean that. One afternoon, several weeks after the trial, Ethan found himself sitting in a quiet park near his neighborhood. His hand had healed well, though there was still a sharp pain at times if he moved too quickly. He sat on a bench, watching the children play on swings and slides, their laughter echoing in the air. It was a sight completely at odds with the memories still haunting him: Sophie's terrified face, the shadowy forests, and the gruesome evidence from that motel room. But this scene reminded him of what they were fighting for. Moments like these, where children could simply be children, unafraid, unscarred. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Officer Foster. Ethan looked up to see Stella Miller standing a few steps away, Sophie's hand tightly clasped in hers. Peter followed behind, carrying a picnic basket. Sophie's face lit up when she saw Ethan, and she ran toward him, clutching her doll tightly under one arm. Officer Foster, she called, throwing herself into his arms. Ethan smiled, kneeling down to meet her eyes. Hey, Sophie, how are you doing? I'm good, Sophie replied, her voice cheerful and confident, warming Ethan's heart. Mom and Dad brought me to the park, and I'm going back to school soon. That's great to hear, Ethan said softly. You're a brave little girl, you know that? Sophie grinned widely, holding up her doll. I still have her. Stella stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. We can never thank you enough for what you've done, she said. You saved our daughter. Peter nodded, his voice steady yet emotional. If there's anything we can do for you, just say the word. Ethan shook his head, standing and looking at them. I don't need anything. Just keep being the wonderful parents you are. That's all Sophie needs. Stella hugged him for a moment before stepping back, her voice thick with emotion. You're a good man, Officer Foster. Never doubt that. As the Miller family walked away, Ethan watched them for a moment, a small smile forming on his lips. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. Sophie was safe, her family reunited, and for now, that was all that mattered. That evening, Ethan returned to his patrol work. The long street stretched out before him, bathed in the amber light of the street lamps. The hum of the patrol car engine was familiar, but his eyes remained sharp, scanning each passing vehicle, every pedestrian, every shadow. He knew better than anyone that danger could strike at any moment, and the unimaginable could happen in the blink of an eye. But he also knew that one person could make a difference. Just one simple decision, pulling over a car, trusting his instincts, could change everything. This story serves as a reminder of the power of decisiveness, courage, and timely action. What would you do if faced with the choice between protecting a life and confronting danger? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could make a difference and inspire others who need the courage to act. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family, spreading the message of resilience and bravery. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.